This is my 54th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 28th dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part covers my build of the Superquick Greystones Farmhouse card kit, B24. This is the kit as it comes, absolutely standard thin Superquick package. And here are the contents, again absolutely the Superquick standard. One folded sheet of printed card parts, 2 paper sheets with instructions, one of which also has some paper parts, a small cramped sheet of glazing parts, and a warranty card. As is usual with Superquick kits, the instructions are mostly verbal with a few illustrations for clarity, but not enough really. Things could be a lot clearer with more illustrations. As it is, it's quite a struggle to follow the instructions. And I do not have any trouble understanding English. If you did, I think you'd really struggle to cope with one of these kits. Here's the sheet of printed card parts opened out. As usual with Superquick kits, the parts are printed touching each other and sometimes embedded in each other. With this kit I found it even more difficult than usual to get the parts out of the sheet without damaging something. Here's the back of that sheet. The Superquick standard of brown card with printed paper glued to it. This arrangement leads to parts that are constantly trying to warp, and assembly is a constant battle against warping parts, with some help from the various fold-over tabs and straightening struts provided in the kit. Here's the first part out from the sheet, the front and side upper walls. I haven't removed the window blanks and attached brackets yet. Here's that part with the window blanks taken out and the brackets detached. 2 of those brackets will be used soon. The other 2 will sit around on the bench until almost the end of assembly. Removing the window blanks is always also a challenge with Superquick kits. They're held in place with quite robust joins, usually at the corners. If you just try and push the blanks out, those joins will lead to nasty, jagged, torn pieces, so you really need to cut through the joins with a sharp knife, but it's extremely tricky to do so without nicking the frames. Here I have attempted to select suitable glazing pieces for these windows. Unlike some Superquick kits where the glazing parts are numbered, with this kit you're just left with a guessing game as to which glazing pieces to use for which windows, and I found it quite a tricky guessing game, especially with the small windows, which are very slightly different in size. I think the glazing piece I've selected here for the small window actually turned out to be meant for the dormer window, which gets done well towards the end. The Superquick instructions always say to attach the glazing pieces with sticky tape, and I always decline to do so as I wouldn't trust the results to last. So I glue the glazing pieces in place, wherever possible leaving some extra material attached to the glazing pieces to make gluing them in place easier. Here are those windows with their glazing from the outside. I have switched the glazing piece for the small window and put the piece I originally selected aside. The grey tabs all fold back and glue. This helps to take the warp out of the walls, at least at the bottom. I have a piece of tape on one of the tabs at the top as it was almost falling off. I didn't cut it at all, the scoring was just too far through as it came. Now the top blue tabs fold back at right angles. The tabs on either side are held at the right angle using the blue brackets that were detached previously. This is the interior floor piece for those walls. That floor piece fits above the grey tabs. First I glued it into the corner between the front wall and one side. Then I folded the other side wall and glued it to the floor. This is the back upper wall, with its window blanks already removed. The 2 small blue tabs at top left came out of one of the window openings. These windows are glazed. Again, it was quite tricky selecting the correct small pieces. And here are those glazed windows from the outside. Note that the wall is not flat at this point. This is normal for Superquick parts. The bottom grey tab is folded back and glued down. This helps to straighten the wall, though you can see that it's still not really straight. Now the top blue tab folds back at a right angle and is held in place with the two small blue brackets that came out of the window opening. The wall is pretty much straight now. Now that wall is glued in place between the back ends of the two upper side walls. Due to their warp, the side walls were not naturally the correct distance apart at the back, so gluing the back wall in place involved forcing the side walls to adopt the correct distance. So the joints needed to be held firmly in place until the glue dried, or the natural bend of the walls would pop them apart. A flat cross strut is then glued across the middle between the front and back walls, glued underneath the tabs. This helps to keep the tops of the front and back walls more or less straight and the correct distance apart. Next, a folded ridge board is glued across between the peaks of the side walls. This serves mainly to keep the tops of the side walls the correct distance apart. Now assembly turns to the lower walls. This is the part for the lower front and side walls. The waste is removed, the small grey interior tabs are cut free and folded outward, and the yellow tabs are all folded back and glued. Now brackets are used to hold the side walls at right angles to the front wall. The brackets glue down on top of the yellow tabs, making quite a strong corner. The other side wall is fixed at a right angle the same way. This is the back lower wall. Again, two tabs come from one of the window openings and are saved. Suitable glazing pieces are located. The big ones were easy. I think I got the little one wrong again at first. The yellow tab is folded back and glued down, and the glazing pieces are glued in place. This has to be done whilst looking at the windows from the outside in order to precisely position the glazing. The small grey brackets are used to fix the grey tab at a right angle. The back lower wall is glued between the back ends of the lower side walls. Again, the distance didn't naturally come out right and needed to be forced. For some reason, the end tabs of the side walls ended up sticking out at the bottom, as you can see at left centre here. This wasn't helpful, and I had to shave off those protrusions. A folded cross strut is glued between the front and back walls in the middle to keep the walls straight and the right distance apart at the top. The instructions say to glue the paving in place next. This is not easy. The front paving wasn't too bad, although it did tend to warp, and so it wasn't easy to stick to the bottom of the front wall. Note that I'm working on scrap foam board here to avoid smearing glue on my cutting mat. The side paving was the very devil to get in place. It was next to impossible to get it joined to the end of the front paving and also fix it under the side walls. I resorted to gluing pieces of paper across underneath in order to hold the side paving in place, as this seemed to be the only way I could really get it to stay where it should be. These pieces are for the bay, although I wouldn't really call it a bay. This will be the front section of the lower part of the building. The last of the larger glazing pieces are attached behind these window openings. The small grey interior tabs are cut loose, and they really need to be cut, and are bent outward. At this point I realised I hadn't done anything about curtaining the windows. This isn't a feature of the kit as it comes, and the instructions don't even mention the possibility of curtaining, but as a private house I really felt that there should be some curtains, at least at some of the windows. I had made extra curtains by scanning paper curtain parts that came with Metcalfe kits and then duplicating them and printing sheets of curtains from my PC. At one point in the past, Metcalfe instructions just used to suggest cutting pieces of coloured paper from magazines or similar to make curtains, and you could of course do that. The curtains need to have coloured edges to go behind the windows themselves and enough tab at the side to glue beside the windows. I glued curtains behind the windows in the bay wall. It would of course have been easier if I'd done all of the curtains while the walls were still flat, but I forgot. Since I'd forgotten to do so, I went back now and glued curtains behind at least the large windows, here in the front upper wall, and here in the back upper wall, and here in the back lower wall. Having dealt with the curtains, at least for the larger windows, I went on with the assembly. The bay walls are folded and glued round formers, one at the top, and then a second at the bottom. Then the bay assembly is glued to the lower front walls and also glued down to the paving, which helps to hold the paving more firmly in place. This is the part for the entry porch. This led me to a fairly lengthy digression. I didn't actually want to call this house Greystones Farm, as I intended to put it beside the railway station on my layout, where it would effectively be on a busy street with many other buildings, which wouldn't really seem at all a likely place for a farmhouse. So I spent some considerable time hunting around for a suitable name. I just couldn't quite decide what I wanted to call the house. None of the names I came across seemed completely ideal. I narrowed it down to 5 or 6 possibilities and eventually settled on Station Lodge. I scanned the part and printed an alternate version from my PC. Scanning and then printing never seems to produce colours even close to matching. Everything seems to come out much darker, so I punch up the brightness and contrast to make my printed version show more clearly. Here I've fished out the rest of the parts for the porch, a floor, a former and the front door. I cut out my replacement house nameplate and glued it over the door on the Superquick part. I glued the porch walls round the porch floor. Wrongly, as it turned out, as I had trouble understanding the instructions. I glued the former in above the folded back inner side walls, gluing the tops of these to the former to hold them at the right angle, which wasn't easy as those inner side walls really didn't want to sit at the right angle. Then I realized that the floor should have been glued directly below those inner folded walls, not at the bottom of the outer walls, so I had to detach the floor and re-glue it in place. Then the front door is glued on behind the inner side walls, sitting down on the floor. Then that assembled porch is glued onto the front of the bay and also glued down to the paving. These are the parts for the chimney stacks, which go on either side of the building and which the instructions say to make and attach at this point. And they're certainly quite right that you need to do so because of the way the upper walls fit. Each of the stacks folds around 2 formers, making a fairly rigid card structure. Then these assemblies glue to the side walls, with the little grey folded out tabs helping to guide them into place, at least that's the idea. Now the upper wall assembly is glued onto the lower wall assembly. This goes together quite oddly, and the instructions quite correctly, or wisely at least, tell you to put it in place without any glue and make sure you understand how it goes before attempting to glue it. It certainly didn't go how I first thought it might. The bottom of the back of the upper assembly fits directly behind the top of the back lower wall, overlapping that back lower wall by 1/8 of an inch or a bit more. Then the rest of the upper walls rest on the tops of the chimney stacks at the side and on the top of the porch at the front. The upper walls basically don't seem to touch the lower assembly at all, except at those points. Here's the assembly from the front. The upper walls are firmly attached to the lower walls at the back because of the overlap, but there's not really much holding them down at the front, just the small points where they touch the chimney stacks and the porch. Now we're about ready to attach the main roof, but the instructions say to do the gutters first, unless you're just not going to bother with them. I'm always a bit torn with regards to Superquick gutters. They're kind of a pain to do, and I'm not sure how much they add to the finished building, but I guess they do add something, so I always end up using them. These gutters are most unusual, being sort of an off-white colour. Usually the gutters are black. The gutters need to fold double and glue, which is not at all easy to do with these long, thin paper parts. Then the tabs fold up, ready to glue under the edges of the roof. This is the main roof part. The green tab for the dormer needs to be released and folded back. Here I have glued the gutters under all of the front and back edges of the roof. I did trim the bits that stuck out from the ends after this. I glued the front section of the main roof down to the side and front walls. I didn't glue down the back section as I wanted to be able to get inside while I worked on the dormer. The instructions actually say to do other things first, but knowing how tricky dormers usually are, I wanted to get this done first. These are the card parts for the dormer. I glazed the dormer window, finally using the very first small window glazing piece I'd selected at the start, but I had to cut its material down a bit to get it to fit into the dormer. But it was meant to go there, that's what it's for. Then the dormer folds around its former and is glued. The dormer is then pushed through the gap in the main roof and sits with its bottom front edge on the bottom of the opening. I glued this in place from the inside, as it would have been hard to do from the outside. So you're looking here at the inside of the front roof with the dormer in the middle there protruding back. Here's the dormer in place seen from the outside. Then the dormer roof has to be glued in place. This was a devil to do. It seems that with a roof like this, if you fix it to the walls, it won't join to the main roof, and if you join it to the main roof, it won't sit on the walls properly. Getting it to do both seems to require something between magic and contortionism. With the dormer roof in place, I turned to the gable roofs. The two blue brackets that came out of the upper walls at the very beginning are now glued in place to make ridge boards for the gable roofs. I couldn't for the life of me get this one to stick to both the gable wall and the main roof using card glue, so I eventually resorted to super glue to get it to stay attached. And that super glue you can see there between the ridge board and the main roof. These are the roof parts for the gables. They fold and glue over the gables. Again, it's hard to get them to attach neatly to the main roof and also sit down on the gable walls, but not quite as torturous as that little dormer roof. There's also a roof part for the porch. The instructions didn't seem to mention this, or if they did, I missed it, but clearly this is meant to be the porch roof, and so I glued it in place and also coloured its edges with a marker, as I did to the other roof parts. Now we come to the chimneys. You're expected to make these out of paper, and I absolutely hate this. It's extremely difficult to make anything approximating to a rigid rectangular chimney out of thin paper alone. Here I've done my best to cut out the chimney parts, scoring the backs of them first and glue them round into rectangles. Very tricky to do. If you don't score enough, the paper won't fold properly, but it's very easy to score too much and go right through, as I did in places, so I had to repair with tape. Then card top pieces glue onto the chimneys. Hard to attach as you're just trying to glue them to the edges of pieces of paper. Then paper strips fold around the chimneys to make a sort of brick something or other. First, the broad strip is glued around, then the thin strip is glued on top of that. The whole thing's kind of a mess, as the chimneys have no real rigidity. Now, the bottom corners of those chimneys are slit just a little bit, and the chimneys are glued to the side walls of the building, fitting over the top of the lower chimney stacks. Then, the chimney stack roof pieces need to be glued to the top of the chimney stack walls, whilst also being fitted under the folded out bottoms of the paper chimneys. This wasn't easy to do. Here's the other one. I suppose they didn't turn out too badly, but I really wish they wouldn't do this paper chimney business. Barge boards are glued under the front of the gable roofs with packing pieces behind them to bring the barge boards forward from the walls. We're nearly there now, just a couple of little things to be done. This is the part for the front step. It folds in two and glues in front of the porch, but that white piece above the step looked odd to me. So I glued a piece of grey card across the bottom of the porch and coloured the bit of the white that showed above with a soft pencil. Then I glued the front folded step in place. I think this looks better, though others may differ. Just the ridge tiles to do now. These are paper parts, and they need to be scored on the back and then cut out. Here are the various ridge tile pieces after separation. I coloured the edges with a brown marker. I had to use the small marker for the little stepped ends that fit around the chimneys. All of the ridge tiles fold in the middle where they were scored. I fold them over the edge of a thin metal ruler. And all of the ridge tiles are glued in place. I was pleased to find that all of the pieces actually seemed to fit where they were supposed to go, not something you can always assume. Getting the ridge tiles to glue down neatly on both sides of the roof ridges is not easy. They seem to keep wanting to come up here and there, so you need to apply a decent amount of glue to them, but of course if you apply too much it will smear and make nasty marks. Here's the completed building from the back. Much less interesting than the front. Superquick do seem to rather often make their kits basically to be viewed from one side. It's sheer good luck that I've decided to put this building on the layout with the front facing out. I was originally going to place it across from the station so its back would have faced out, but I had to move it to make room for the Bell Inn with its patio. Anyway, here is the house in place on the layout. It's a bit of a tight fit there, not much space between the road and the railway platform. But I really don't have anywhere else for it, and at least placed like this, the more interesting front of the building is on display. Here's the view from the other side. As I say, I was originally going to put this house where the Bell Inn is now, but the Bell Inn absolutely wouldn't fit on the other side by the station, because it has a patio behind it. And here's the view across the layout now. Not really much more space for buildings. I really do need to do something about the vegetation, as there's currently only the original grass and those vague temporary trees. There are actually still a couple more buildings to come. I have a Metcalf kit for a single-road engine shed that's intended to go over the straight track from the turntable in the yard by the far footbridge. And I've bought a little Bachmann Scenecraft cafe that should fit between the station and the ironmonger's shop when that comes in the post from the UK.